Welcome to part 2 of my coming out journey. If you've watched part 1, you know who I am, what I'm about, and why I'm producing this series of videos, so welcome back. Now, when I asked my gay and bi pen pals why they were still internalizing outdated and bullshit patriarchal and colonial-era homophobic propaganda in this era of supposed enlightenment and wokeness, one of them sarcastically retorted with, "Well, I'm guessing someone lives in a nice little liberal bubble." I responded by saying, yeah, perhaps that's the case now, but it certainly wasn't always so, because contrary to a popular misconception that exists about me in the press and the South African Indian community, I do not come from a rich, bougie, highly educated liberal family or background. But I get why that narrative is a convenient one for my deeply closeted pen pals. The notion that someone who presents like me and was a celebrity couldn't possibly relate to the lived experience and struggles of everyday gay and bi men of color because I must surely have grown up in a super privileged, progressive family and community becomes an easy for you to say counter-argument that exempts them from the admittedly daunting task of coming out and taking ownership of their lives. Of course, that's their prerogative, and I'm definitely not here to pressure, judge, or shame anyone who's afraid or reluctant to come out. That's your choice, your journey, sweetheart. You must do so when you're good and ready, or not at all, if that's your wish. But please, please don't presume to tell me that I couldn't possibly know what it feels like or understand how difficult it is to do so. Because when I look at the climate your generation of LGBTQ plus peeps are coming of age in compared to what it was like when I was growing up, I'm so fucking jelly of you guys. I'm not saying coming out is now easy all of a sudden and that the battle's been won. I mean, there's certainly a lot of hysteria and ignorance undermining the trans cause in particular. They're the latest targets of the great moral panic, which, by the way, is just a culture war nonsense distraction from the fact that your democracy is being eroded and bypassed in the service of global elites and late-stage predatory capitalism. But man, have attitudes towards gay people changed since my day. Even as recently as the early 2000s, gay marriage and adoption were still considered third-rail issues in the culture. Now, my entire Instagram feed is just nothing but gay weddings and gay men and women raising families. It's amazing. To be perfectly honest, I never thought I'd see this level of LGBTQ plus acceptance and compassion in my lifetime. When I observe the green lighting of mainstream releases like Heartstopper and Love, Simon, problematic as it was, and their almost universal appeal, I'm filled with so much wonder and joy, but at the same time, a certain sadness because I mourn for my inner child for whom this kind of content and media would have been a life-saving source of comfort and inspiration at such a vulnerable and scary time. I admit I have to tell myself not to fantasize about what a smoother and speedier journey I might have enjoyed had my generation and the ones before us had such things as will and grace, gay celebrities, the internet, and access to social media and YouTube coming out videos, for example. For context, I was born in 1971 to working-class parents from deeply religious, socially conservative families. I was raised in Durban in the province of Port Natal, as it was known then. My mother was Muslim and of Indian-Iranian descent. My father was Hindu and hailed from the village of Nosari in Gujarat. Incidentally, neither of them converted to the other's faith, and I was raised to respect and appreciate both religions, but chose not to subscribe to either. Growing up, neither of my immigrant parents' circumstances afforded them a formal or higher education. My dad could read and write basic English, but my mum was illiterate. Dad packed crates at his uncle's fruit and vegetable shop when he started out in life. My mum held down multiple jobs to support herself, including apparently that of a truck driver and housekeeper. Both my parents had 2 adolescent children each from their previous marriages, so that by the time I came along, I was the youngest in the family of 5 kids by as much as 13 years. There was a wonderful period in my early childhood that I recall as being incredibly joyful and even idyllic. My parents and siblings doted on me, I had loads of cousins to play with, I actually felt very validated, loved and safe during the formative years of my life. But from a very early age, I knew there was something different about me compared to other kids, and Without knowing what the term gay even meant, I realized from as early as the age of 5 that I was attracted, at least aesthetically at that age, to men, and learned almost immediately that this was judged to be abhorrent, abnormal, and strictly forbidden in the milieu that I was born into. Of course, as a child, I didn't know any better, and so I submitted to what I believed to be the wisdom and moral authority of my caregivers, my community, and the common will, and in doing so, absorbed their revulsion and sneering contempt of homosexuality. In other words, I unconsciously assimilated my culture's homophobia. This is known as internalized oppression or internalized homophobia. Society had warped and turned my conscience against me and made me an enemy of my very own nature and by consequence, myself. I wholesale bought into the idea that what I was wrong and that the world was right to condemn me for it. So I walked around under a dark cloud that is the burden of constantly feeling like the other or a broken piece. What's worse is that at that vulnerable pre-internet and social media age, without a single other gay person in the realm of your existence to look to, never mind a role model, you think you're the only kid in the world that must be this way, so you feel uniquely freakish, defective, and ashamed. And the resultant feelings of guilt, fear, alienation, and self-loathing only grew in intensity, especially as I approached my teens, where, let's face it, a whole world of growing pains awaited me as it is, as it does all of us, regardless of our sexual orientation, because being a teenager sucks. And a great deal of my existential dread stemmed from the fear that I would let my parents and my family down due to my affliction. And furthermore, when you grow up as a person of color in a systemically and institutionally racist society, no matter how much your family loves and validates you, your ethnicity becomes yet another mark of unworthiness you're made to feel like you should seek pardon for. Within my community, the Indian community, I was constantly derided with derogatory taunts like muffy and sissy, and outside of it, I was ridiculed and belittled with racist slurs like chara and coolie. So I lugged around the self-belief that I was less than, and I felt like I needed to apologize at every turn for the dual trespass of being born brown and queer, to justify and seek forgiveness for my existence in the world. And as a result, I developed a debilitating inferiority complex and assumed the posture of someone who was intimidated, penitent, and cowed. And I kept my dirty little secret hidden and buried deep down inside. But despite my best efforts at trying to be just like the other boys, I frequently showed up on the gaydar of my peers at school. I mean, little wonder. I was effeminate and androgynous looking with very pretty features. I was also sweet-natured, trusting, kind-hearted, and artistic. I mean, just look at the sweet summer child. Poor little fella didn't stand a chance in that world. They just ate him alive. As soon as I entered the Indian public schooling system, I was ruthlessly and relentlessly bullied, harassed, and roughed up. Seldom would a day go by when I wouldn't be called a muffy or a sissy, a pretty boy, and often emasculated as a pretty girl. I was too ashamed to tell my parents what was going on at school, but desperately hoped that my educators would step in to intervene to stop the relentless bullying and gay bashing. But not only did my teachers and principals simply look the other way while all of this was happening under their watch, some of my male teachers even joined in with the taunts and name-calling, which of course further emboldened and encouraged the bullying from my peers. So I associated school with suffering and survival, not with safety and learning. But I put on a cheerful, happy face to keep up a semblance of normality, as many kids do when they want to appear normal. To make matters worse, and yet better in a way, I'm also an HSP. That's a highly sensitive person. HSPs get a very unfair rep for being these overly sensitive, delicate, triggered little snowflakes who fall apart at the slightest hurt to their precious little fifis, but that's a lazy oversimplification. HSPs are actually hyper-aware people with a depth of perception that allows them to observe and notice things that others don't. We're very detail-oriented, for example. We're also very mindful not just of our emotions, but of those of other people, which tends to make us naturally empathic. FYI, HSPs aren't better people, just more receptive ones, with shall we say, very sensitive antenna. HSPs are also deep thinkers with a rich internal world from which to process things. So even as a kid, I spent a lot of time in introspective thought, self-reflection and contemplation. And with that came a certain maturity and self-awareness that was beyond my years. And just as well, because that precociousness would stand me in good stead for the challenging years that were about to come. As I mentioned, my family was working class, but there was a very pleasant period in the late 70s when we briefly ascended to middle class status thanks to my dad's very successful venture into the Indian film distribution business. But things took a very dark turn when we were plunged back into living hand to mouth after my dad went all in on an ill-timed investment in an ambitious multi-screen movie cineplex at a time when the ubiquitous home video novelty was about to really take off and revolutionize the way people consumed entertainment media. Independent movie houses, including my dad's, and others that were once so iconic in the Indian community soon went bust as a result. So due to financial precarity and reasons of practicality, my parents, siblings, their spouses, and I all found ourselves out of the city and living in the Indian suburb of Reservoir Hills under one roof in a house that had been partitioned into 3 self-contained dwellings. And that's when decades of multi-generational trauma suffered way before my time came home to roost. Under strained circumstances and in each other's pockets, too close for comfort proximity, our family system soon devolved into a high-conflict antagonistic one that did not make for a happy, healthy environment for a child. There was a lot of drama, rancor, and strife. All the adults seemed to be emotionally dysregulated and permanently at each other's throats with bitter and ugly scenes and recriminate back-and-forth shouting matches and fights. And I was frequently caught in the vitriolic crossfire. Even as a kid, it occurred to me that I was watching a masterclass in how not to adult. And believe me, I took copious mental notes. In fact, I credit my family's tumultuous relationships for my interest in psychology and why I grew up determined to be a good listener and communicator. Because I remember observing back then, for example, that the language the so-called grown-ups employed was weaponized to be deliberately hurtful, insulting, and barbed so as to hook each other into more conflict and escalate the argument. So people were speaking at each other, not to each other, which just betrayed a fundamental unseriousness about communication, mutual understanding, and conflict resolution. Almost every night after supper, I would get on my bicycle and ride around the neighborhood for hours at a time just to get away from all the toxicity and clear my head. I'd sometimes return as late as 10 p.m. on a school night and hardly anyone noticed my absence. That's how distracted and self-involved the adults were. Now, please understand that I'm saying all of this about my family with a lot of benevolence and compassion. These were not inherently bad people. They were just hurting inside. I was too young and inexperienced to see or understand it back then, but later, as a seasoned psychologized adult, I came to empathize with the trauma, dehumanizing poverty, and systemic oppression that had damaged them as people. And without the facility for critical introspection and self-awareness that would have perhaps enabled them to unpack the roots of their dysfunction, they were simply lashing out in pain. Traumatized people traumatize people. Hurt people hurt people. I don't condone it. It doesn't make it okay. I tell you this not to justify it, but merely to explain it. You must also understand, it was a very different time. In an unjust society like South Africa was back then, nobody talked about mental health issues, trauma bonding, codependency, and other complex psychological phenomena like we do today. Well, certainly not working class POCs. When you're in survival mode all the time, you don't have the luxury of working on self. And as for therapy, even if you could afford such a thing, it was extremely stigmatized in the culture. It still is in some circles, unfortunately. But to be perfectly frank, having been around the block as often as I have, I can assure you my family are really not unique in our dysfunction. I've peeked behind the curtains of enough upstanding, pillar of the community type families to know that they're all full of shit. So don't be fooled by the perfect family cosplay on social media. Most families, even the model ones, are messy and complicated AF. Sadly, though, things just got worse with mine as the years wore on. Domestic spousal abuse, now both verbal and physical, gradually became an almost daily occurrence, and alcoholism a further destructive factor in one of the households in particular. Then one day, at age 11, I awoke in the dark of night from a deep sleep with abject horror and frozen panic at the grotesque realization that there was an adult man in bed beside me attempting to penetrate me. He did not succeed in doing so that night because he realized I was now awake. My body just jolted and went rigid when I came to and realized what was being done to me. But unfortunately for me, it did not deter this fuck monster from trying again and again and again. The sexual assaults continued intermittently until I hit puberty, and by then I'd all but lost any sense of safety and welfare that allow for a young person's childlike innocence to remain intact. So let's just say I grew up rather quickly. But before I go on, let me take a moment for a quick sidebar to debunk some very dangerous misconceptions out there on the subject. Firstly, my abuser was not gay. He was a straight, married man. Secondly, to be very clear, the abuse did not make me gay. It doesn't work that way, so please banish that stupid stereotype from your brain. I've encountered a lot, and I do mean a lot, of straight guys who were sexually assaulted by men when they were boys, and though it really messed them up, it didn't make them any more gay than the disgusting, vile practice of corrective rape makes a lesbian straight. If anything, you have to understand that the preponderance of gay men who were sexually abused as boys can probably be attributed to the fact that a lot of sexual predators and groomers are very cunning at singling out their victims. They hone in on the kids who are socially awkward, unassertive, and lacking in confidence, so they're less likely to report the abuse. And who invariably matches that description? LGBTQ+ kids. We're conscious of our otherness from a very young age, and if the environment we grow up in is hostile to our kind, it severely hampers our self-esteem and self-value. Cunning predators sense this vulnerability and prey upon it. Thirdly, if you're feeling sorry for my inner child at this point, thank you, but please don't. I'm not trying to elicit any sympathy here, so you can put away the violin. I'm good and he's good. In fact, I give that sweet little boy lots of love, affirmation, and warm mental hugs on the regular. And finally, please don't use my story to victim shame other sexual abuse survivors who are still struggling with transcending their trauma. I realize I must come across as unfazed and strangely casual about my abuse, but that's because I've done a fuck ton of work on myself. And besides, every survivor's circumstances are different. I know a guy who was violently raped when he was just 5 years old, and I cannot begin to comprehend the enormity of his pain and CPTSD. Okay, just wanted to make those quick points. Now, I know what you're about to ask. Did I tell anyone about the abuse? The answer is no. I saw two compelling reasons for not doing so. Firstly, my parents were under enormous pressure to keep the lights on and put food on the table, and I didn't want to burden them and their already strained marriage and financial woes with this upsetting revelation. And I didn't tell any of my siblings either because by then they were all fully immersed in and distracted with their own young adult dramas, and it was obvious that none of them wanted to deal with the added hassle of attending to the emotional needs of an annoying baby brother. I wasn't a cute toddler anymore. The doting and attention I had once enjoyed and long since worn off, and I was often made to feel like a nuisance who was under everyone's feet all the time. In fact, one of my sisters used to refer to me as irrits behind my back, so I just withdrew into my own inner world. And the second reason for not speaking up was because the dick of a man to whom the wayward penis belonged was a much admired and trusted member of my extended family, and even at that tender age, my not yet fully developed brain was savvy enough to recognize the optics and politics of perception I would be up against if I did, in fact, call this man out. I reasoned that even if I did tell someone about what was being done to me, I was probably not going to be believed, especially under those fraught and chaotic circumstances, because Through my family's dysfunctional and uncritical lens, my abuser would have seemed like the least likely candidate to come anywhere close to matching the profile of a pedophile, never mind a pederast. As I said, he was heterosexual and married, with a reputation for being quite the ladies' man. He was also a man's man, the kind of guy other men looked to. On the surface, he was attractive, confident, intelligent, educated, and superficially charming as fuck. No one in my family was sophisticated or discerning enough to detect the troubled narcissist that lurked within. So there was no way my pre-adolescent brain deduced that any of the so-called adults in the room were going to believe that this dude, this alpha, this jock, this man's man, ladies' man, would be the kind of guy who got his rocks off trying to sodomize little boys while they slept. To say that it would have strained credulity would have been an understatement. In fact, many years afterwards, when I was in my 20s, I actually did tell my siblings what had happened, and it wasn't for my own unburdening or cathartic release. I wouldn't have even brought it up were it not for the fact that it was germane to a conversation we were having at the time about this man's mental health, which was finally being called into question. Silly me, I actually thought I was doing them a service by letting them know that, hey, FYI guys, that there was this whole even more fucked up side to the guy, and lo and behold, it turns out my 11-year-old self was right all along. My claim was met with loads of disbelief and skepticism. Was I hurt? Little. Surprised? No. In fact, one of my siblings casually approached my former abuser with my allegation and was completely satisfied with his strenuous denial. Like, duh. What did they expect him to say? Yeah, I tried to fuck your baby brother multiple times, but the silly kid kept waking up before I could hit a home run. Please. Apparently, he just laughed it off as just some fever dream of a kid with an overactive imagination. I mean, because which 11-year-old child doesn't dream of waking up to the realization that the waistband of his jam bottoms has been stripped down to his thighs and the sensation of a moist, pre-cum lubricated, erect penis probing his butt cheeks? Am I right? The joys of childhood. Okay. Some of you might be thinking, too much information, why are you telling us all of this, and how is it even relevant to your coming out journey in the first place? Well, because, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, it helps to paint a picture of the fiery crucible and hellish circumstances under which my unbreakable adamantine titanium backbone was forged. The aftermath of the abuse and my home life dramas awakened and activated several things within me that I think were core to not only why I came out to my family, but also to the unapologetic, unflinching, don't fuck with me manner with which I did. Firstly, the most significant thing that the wounding and trauma of my abuse and troubled home life precipitated was a process of untimely individuation. It resulted in a break from my inner child's illusions and need for attachment. Because I no longer felt safe, I'd withdrawn inward to that HSP child's inner world, and left to my own devices, I had to figure out how to take care of my emotional and psychological needs for and by myself. And during this period of self-soothing and healing, I developed a fierce spirit of independence and self-sufficiency. I learned how to be resourceful and self-reliant. So basically, I was forced into a period of self-parenting, right down to supervising my own homework and cultivating self-discipline and self-motivation. This, by the way, was ground zero for the compulsive control freakery and obsessive perfectionism that characterized most of my early adult years, and it nearly destroyed me, a la Black Swan. By age 35, I'd completely crashed and burnt out. By the way, perfectionism and control freakery are very common traits in childhood trauma and abuse survivors because children need safety and stability, and when they're deprived of it, their adult selves work overtime in making sure that they're never not in control again. I can't tell you how much of work it took to deprogram myself of those two extremely destructive habits. Anyway, going back to that period in my childhood, the second shift that occurred was that my family's dysfunction blew off all the aura of moral authority, credibility, and virtue I had hitherto conferred upon them. They were now humanized as deeply flawed beings in my eyes. So if any of them dared to moralize from on high over my being gay, I would have just laughed in their faces. In fact, at family gatherings around birthdays, Eid, Diwali, and Christmas celebrations, I had Christian in-laws, BTW, when we had visitors over and the adults weren't trying to kill each other and we were all pretending that we were a perfectly normal, well-adjusted family. Jeez, talk about gaslighting. I would often disengage from all the festivities as a kid and surreptitiously observe my parents, siblings, and their partners from the sidelines with a kind of mature detachment and quiet condescension, often feeling like the only real grown-up in my family. Dr. Gabor Mate, the internationally renowned physician, author, and speaker, and a wonderfully insightful man, frequently talks about how when a child is born, it has two needs: the need for attachment and the need for authenticity. And these dual needs continue with us into adulthood. But when people are presented with the choice of either attachment or authenticity in their relationships, most will choose attachment first, seeking approval and recognition from others instead of learning how to give it to themselves. Simply put, most of us will decide that it is far more important for others to like us than it is for us to do whatever it takes to like ourselves. And when the need for attachment is in the driver's seat, respect and acceptance from others is viewed as having more value than self-respect and self-acceptance. Having severed that attachment need so prematurely, I felt free to pursue the alternative. In fact, I consciously chose a path of authenticity. Without even realizing it or knowing what that was at that age, I'd actually set an intention for myself. I had adopted "to thine own self be true" as my guiding principle long before I even came across the Shakespearean quote. And this meant coming out to myself in a very self-affirming, self-assertive, and almost ceremonious way. There would be no more self-abnegation or self-abandonment. I wasn't going to be in denial about being gay or burying my truth anymore. I was going to fucking own it, even if only to myself at first. And emboldened with that as my sovereign call and guiding light, if you will, I was set on a course, without even realizing it, towards radical self-acceptance, a hyper-vigilant relationship with the truth, and a lifelong pursuit of self-determination and, more importantly, self-determinism. I was going to be the author of my story. Society be damned, I was going to decide how I should feel about myself. I was going to be firmly in the driver's seat of my own destiny, and I was not going to be a victim. Instead, I chose to see myself as a sort of valiant Varga the victor, rising above the chaos of his circumstances. And with that resolve, I felt strangely imbued with a sense of power and a spirit of defiance that I didn't even know I was capable of at that age. So that by the time I was ready to come out to my family, as anxious as I was about hurting or upsetting them, I think they all instinctively knew that I was not going to blink or back down, that my being gay was a non-negotiable, and that although I would welcome their blessings, I certainly wasn't asking for their permission. With the singular exception of my father, who, bless his heart, quite laughably thought I would bend the knee or roll over, the rest of my family sensed or could intuit from my tone and the look in my eyes that if they did condemn or reject me, they were welcome to. But I was not going to yield any power or my autonomy over to anyone. That even though my society hated me and my kind, I'd accepted myself, and I was not going to pretend to be something that I wasn't. And anyone who disapproved or dared ask it of me ran the very perceptible risk of losing me. Because, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the person with the power in any relationship is the one with enough self-respect and courage to walk away if the other refuses to value or respect them. Now, to be clear, I'm not recommending this as a course of action for anyone watching this, nor am I saying, by the way, that you need to have endured sexual abuse and childhood trauma in order to find your voice and live authentically. No. You can get to a place of unapologetic authenticity without all that. I'm simply making a point about how people tend to fight shy of individuals who demonstrate integrity and courage of conviction, especially in the face of adversity. They may not appear to like it or even accept it, but secretly, they'll respect and even admire you for it. In part because they know in their heart of hearts that you have truth on your side, but mostly because in a world filled with feckless sellouts, moral cowards who hide behind masks and lies and go along to get along, nutless wonders afraid of their own fucking shadows, it's just so rare to come across someone with the strength of character, moral courage and fortitude to hold their head up high and firmly stand their ground on principle. Now, I've had many derogatory terms hurled at me throughout my life, but pussy ain't one of them. And with that term, I'm not invoking female genitalia, by the way. It's shorthand for the word pusillanimous, which means a lack of courage and determination. Look it up. You're welcome.